The wind held off the Cornish cliffs, carrying the sharp tang of salt and seaweed through the open windows of Margaret's cottage. At 68, Margaret Penrose had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the sea, its restless ebb and flow a mirror to her own life. Her small home in St. Ives, perched on a hill overlooking Porthmeor Beach, was a sanctuary of weathered wood and mismatched furniture, every corner filled with half-finished canvases, jars of paintbrushes, and the faint scent of turpentine. The walls bore her seascapes, wild, churning waves captured in blues and grays, each stroke a testament to her resilience after years of solitude. Margaret stood at her easel, a canvas half covered in the violent greens of a stormy sea, when the knock came. It was a sharp, impatient rap, out of place in the quiet village where neighbors announced themselves with a cheerful call. She set down her brush, wiped her hands on her paint-splattered apron, and opened the door. The sight stole her breath. Daniel, her son, stood there, his broad shoulders filling the frame. Beside him was Clara, his fiancée, her sleek blonde hair and designer coat a stark contrast to the rugged coastline behind her. Their smiles were tight, practiced, their eyes darting past Margaret to the cottage's interior. She hadn't seen them in 15 years, not since Daniel, swayed by Clara's ambitions, had cut her out of his life like a blemish on a perfect canvas. "Mother," Daniel said, his voice strained with a warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "It's been too long. May we come in?" Margaret's heart clenched, a familiar ache she'd buried under layers of paint and time. She studied them, Daniel's tailored suit, slightly creased from travel, Clara's manicured nails, clutching a handbag that screamed money they no longer had. The local gossip, carried on the wind like the cries of gulls, had warned her of their financial troubles, a failed tech startup, debts piling up. And now, here they were, on her doorstep, just weeks after the news of her inheritance had spread. 15 years, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "And now you're here. How timely." She stepped aside, gesturing them in with a painter's grace, her eyes never leaving their faces. The cottage was modest but warm, its walls adorned with Margaret's art and a few framed sketches from her teaching days. The panoramic view of the Atlantic stretched beyond the windows, a living painting that dwarfed the small space. Clara's gaze lingered on a corner where a tarp covered a stack of canvases, part of the inheritance from Margaret's former student, Julian Harrow, whose posthumous fame had turned his early works into a fortune. "We heard about Julian," Clara said, her tone soft but calculated, as she sat on a worn velvet sofa. "Such a tragedy, but what a legacy. You must be overwhelmed." Margaret poured tea from a chipped pot, her hands steady from years of wielding brushes. "Overwhelmed? No. Honored, perhaps. Julian was a brilliant boy. I taught him when he was just 13, all gangly limbs and wild ideas. He never forgot me, even when the world called him a genius." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "Unlike some." Daniel flinched, his fingers tightening around his teacup. "Mother, we know we've been distant. Life got complicated. Clara's career, my business, it took us away." "Away," Margaret repeated, her voice sharp as a palette knife. 15 years of silence isn't away, Daniel. It's erasure. No calls, no letters, not even an invitation to your engagement party. And your daughter, my granddaughter, Sophie, I've never met her. She's what, 10 now?" Clara shifted, her smile faltering. "We didn't mean to hurt you, Margaret. It was just timing. We were young, building our lives. You understand, don't you?" Margaret's laugh was bitter, like the salt spray outside. "Understand? I understand that I sold my own paintings to pay for your university, Daniel. I understand that I spent Sundays at the St. Ives market, selling sketches to tourists to keep a roof over my head while you and Clara dined in London's finest restaurants. I understand that you forgot I existed until you heard about Julian's paintings." The air grew heavy, the only sound the distant crash of waves. Daniel's face reddened, but Clara leaned forward, her voice smooth as polished glass. "We made mistakes, Margaret. We're here to make amends. Sophie would love to meet you. We want to be a family again. Margaret's eyes narrowed. She'd heard the whispers at the market, Clara's failed fashion line, Daniel's startup bleeding cash. They weren't here for family. They were here for the paintings, now valued at over £3 million, stored under that tarp in her cottage. She decided to test them. "Come to the community center tomorrow," she said, her tone deceptively light. "I'm teaching an art class for local children. Bring Sophie. Let's see if we can start rebuilding." Daniel nodded eagerly, but Clara's smile was a thin veneer. Margaret sipped her tea, watching them like a hawk watches prey. 15 years ago, Margaret's world had been brighter, filled with the laughter of a young Daniel and the warmth of their small terraced house in Truro. She'd been a single mother, widowed when Daniel was 5, pouring her heart into teaching art at the local secondary school. Her classroom was a haven for misfits like Julian Harrow, whose chaotic sketches hid a prodigy's talent. She'd nurtured him, just as she'd nurtured Daniel, sacrificing her own dreams to fund his ambitions. When Daniel met Clara at a London networking event, everything changed. Clara, with her polished accent and sharp ambition, saw Margaret as an anchor to a past Daniel needed to shed. "You're too provincial, Mum," Daniel had said once, his words cutting deeper than any knife. "Clara's family moves in different circles. We need to focus on our future." The exclusions began subtly. Missed Sunday dinners. Unanswered calls. A wedding invitation that never arrived. It was a small affair, Clara had said over the phone, her voice dripping with false regret. "We didn't want to burden you with travel." Margaret had smiled through the pain, nodding to the empty air, pretending it didn't hurt. The final blow came when Sophie was born. Margaret had knitted a blanket, poured her love into every stitch, and sent it with a card. It was returned, unopened, with a note, "We're keeping things simple for now. Please respect our space." That was the last she'd heard from them until today. Margaret had survived by throwing herself into her art and her community. She taught free classes at the St. Ives Community Center, her laughter mingling with children's as they splattered paint and dreamed big. She sold her seascapes at the market, her hands rough from years of work, her heart scarred but unbroken. The locals knew her story, Mrs. Penrose, the artist who'd raised a son only to be discarded. They bought her paintings not out of pity, but because her work captured the soul of Cornwall's wild coast. When Julian Harrow died in a car accident at 40, his will shocked Margaret. He'd left her his early works, dozens of canvases from his teenage years, painted under her guidance. They'd sat in her attic until a London gallerist recognized their value, turning Margaret into an overnight millionaire. She hadn't touched the money, save for a new easel and a donation to the community center. The paintings remained under that tarp, a reminder of a boy who'd valued her when her own son hadn't. The next morning, the community center buzzed with children's chatter. Margaret stood at the front, her apron smeared with fresh paint, guiding a group of 10-year-olds through a watercolor exercise. The room smelled of paper and possibility, sunlight streaming through tall windows onto mismatched tables. She scanned the door, half expecting Daniel and Clara to skip the class. But they arrived, late, with Sophie in tow, a slight girl with Daniel's hazel eyes and a shy smile. "Grandma?" Sophie whispered, clutching a sketchpad. Margaret's heart lurched. She knelt, meeting the girl's gaze. "That's me, love," she said softly. "Want to paint the sea with us?" Sophie nodded, her shyness melting as Margaret handed her a brush. Daniel and Clara hovered awkwardly, their city clothes out of place among the paint-splattered chaos. Margaret watched them, noting Clara's forced smile as she pretended to admire a child-smudged seagull. Daniel tried to engage, but his questions, about the painting's storage, their appraisal, betrayed his true interest. After the class, Sophie lingered, showing Margaret her painting, a lopsided boat on a turquoise sea. "It's for you," she said, her voice small but earnest. Margaret's throat tightened. She hugged the girl, feeling the weight of lost years, but also a spark of hope. Maybe Sophie was her chance at something real. Over tea at the cottage that afternoon, Clara's mask began to slip. "Those paintings," she said, eyeing the tarp. They must be a burden to store. Have you considered selling? We know people in London who could help, discreetly, of course. Margaret's smile was razor-sharp. A burden? No, Clara. They're a gift. Julian trusted me to care for them, not to sell them for quick cash. Daniel shifted, his discomfort palpable. We're not here for that, Mum. We're in a rough spot. The business collapsed. We're renting a flat we can't afford. Sophie's school fees are overdue. Margaret leaned back, her tea untouched. And you thought your mother, who you haven't spoken to in 15 years, would be your bank? Tell me, Daniel, did you think of me when you were riding high? When you bought that fancy car, or when Sophie took her first steps? Daniel's face crumpled, but Clara pressed on. We're family, Margaret. Families help each other. Sophie deserves better than this mess we're in. The mention of Sophie stung, but Margaret had learned to spot manipulation. She'd spent years with the women at the market, widows, mothers, survivors like her, who'd taught her that family wasn't just blood. It was respect, loyalty, presence. You don't get to use Sophie as a bargaining chip, she said, her voice low. You denied me the chance to be her grandmother. Now you want my money to fix your mistakes? The room fell silent, save for the distant roar of the sea. Sophie, playing with crayons in the corner, looked up, sensing the tension. Margaret softened her tone. Sophie, love, why don't you pick a book from the shelf? We'll read later. As Sophie scampered off, Clara's composure cracked. You're being selfish, Margaret. Those paintings could change our lives, Sophie's life. Don't you care? Margaret stood, her frame small but unyielding. Care? I cared when I worked double shifts to pay for Daniel's degree. I cared when I spent Christmases alone, knitting blankets for a granddaughter I'd never meet. I cared when you called me provincial, a burden, an embarrassment. Where was your care then? Daniel's eyes glistened, but he said nothing. Clara, however, stood, her voice sharp. You're holding a grudge, Margaret. That's not family. That's spite. Margaret walked to the window, the sea a churning mirror of her emotions. Spite? No, Clara. This is dignity. I've built a life without you. My art, my students, my community, they're my family now. You don't get to waltz in and demand a piece of it because you're broke. The days that followed were a test of Margaret's resolve. Daniel and Clara stayed in St. Ives, renting a room at a local B&B, their presence a constant shadow. They attended her classes, brought Sophie to paint, and made a show of remorse. Daniel's apologies grew more heartfelt, his eyes haunted by memories of the boy who'd once sat at Margaret's table, sketching beside her. Clara, however, remained calculating, her questions always circling back to the paintings. Margaret's routine kept her grounded. Mornings were spent painting, her brush capturing the sea's moods, stormy one day, serene the next. Afternoons brought the community center, where children's laughter filled the void left by Daniel's absence. Evenings were for the market women, Evelyn, a widow who sold pottery, Sarah, who baked scones, and Joan, who knitted scarves. They met at Margaret's cottage, sharing tea and stories of children who'd forgotten them, only to return when life turned sour. You're stronger than I was, Evelyn said one evening, her hands cradling a mug. My son came back when his marriage fell apart. I gave him everything, savings, my flat. He left again once he was back on his feet. Margaret nodded, her gaze on the tarp-covered paintings. I want to believe Daniel's sorry. But Clara, she's the poison in his heart. And I won't let her taint Sophie. Joan, her needles clicking, looked up. You've got a chance with that girl, Margaret. Don't let them use her against you. The advice lingered as Margaret prepared for the community's annual art exhibition, a celebration of local talent. She'd planned to unveil one of Julian's paintings, not to sell, but to honor his memory by donating it to the community center. The event was her chance to show Daniel and Clara who she'd become, not the broken woman they'd left behind. The exhibition was held in a converted barn overlooking the harbor, fairy lights twinkling against the night sky. Locals filled the space, their chatter mingling with the clink of wine glasses. Margaret's seascapes lined the walls, vibrant and raw, drawing gasps from the crowd. At the center was Julian's painting, a chaotic swirl of blues and golds, painted when he was 16, capturing the soul of a Cornish storm. Daniel, Clara, and Sophie arrived, dressed for the occasion but out of place among the villagers' casual warmth. Sophie ran to Margaret, hugging her waist. "Your paintings are so pretty, Grandma," she said, her eyes bright. Margaret's heart swelled, but she steeled herself for what was coming. As the crowd gathered, Margaret took the microphone, her voice clear despite the knot in her throat. "This exhibition is about legacy," she said. "Not just mine, but that of a boy I taught years ago, Julian Harrow. He left me his early works, not for profit, but to remind us that art is about connection, not possession. Tonight, I'm donating this painting to our community center, so future generations can find their own voices through art." The crowd applauded, but Clara's face tightened. After the speech, she cornered Margaret near a seascape. "You're giving it away," she hissed. "That painting's worth a fortune. You could secure Sophie's future." Margaret met her gaze, unflinching. "Sophie's future isn't in a painting's price tag. It's in knowing her grandmother's love, something you denied her for 10 years. Daniel approached, his face pale. "Mom, I didn't know how much you'd done for me. For Julian. I'm sorry. I let Clara's ambitions blind me." Clara spun on him. "Don't you dare, Daniel. We need that money. You know what's at stake, our home, Sophie's school." Margaret stepped between them, her voice low but firm. "Clara, you don't get to dictate my choices. Daniel, if you're truly sorry, show it with actions, not words. Start with Sophie. Bring her to my classes. Let her know me. But don't expect my money to fix your mistakes." The crowd's chatter faded as Clara's voice rose. "You're selfish, Margaret. Hoarding wealth while your family suffers." Heads turned, but the locals' faces showed support for Margaret, not Clara. They knew her story, her sacrifices. Daniel took Clara's arm, his voice breaking. "Enough, Clara. This isn't about Mum. It's about us, our failures. I'm done letting you control this." Clara stormed out, her heels clicking on the wooden floor. Daniel lingered, Sophie clutching his hand. "Mom, I don't know how to fix this," he said. "But I want to try. For Sophie. For us." Margaret nodded, her eyes soft but guarded. "Start small, Daniel. Bring Sophie to the cottage tomorrow. We'll paint together. No promises beyond that." The next morning, Daniel arrived alone with Sophie, who carried her sketchpad like a treasure. Clara had stayed at the B&B, her absence a quiet relief. Margaret set up easels on the cliffside, the sea a calm expanse of silver. She taught Sophie to mix blues, her small hands eager but clumsy. Daniel watched, his silence heavy with regret. "I was wrong, Mum," he said finally, as Sophie painted. "Clara wanted a life I couldn't give her. I thought cutting you out would make her happy. But it only made me lose you." Margaret dipped her brush in cerulean, her voice steady. "You didn't just lose me, Daniel. You lost yourself. You let her define your worth. I won't fund your mistakes, but I'll give you a chance to be the son I raised, and the father Sophie deserves." Over the following weeks, Daniel and Sophie became regulars at the cottage. Clara returned to London, her calls to Daniel growing less frequent. Margaret taught Sophie to paint waves, to see beauty in imperfection. Daniel helped at the community center, his hands learning the work of repair, both literal and emotional. The paintings remained under their tarp, a symbol of Margaret's independence. She decided to donate half to the community center, funding art programs for children like Sophie. The rest would stay with her, a reminder of Julian's trust and her own strength. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret stood on her cliffside, Sophie's latest painting, a lopsided seagull, tucked under her arm. Daniel joined her, his face softer, less burdened. "I'm leaving Clara," he said quietly. "I want Sophie to grow up knowing her grandmother. Knowing what real love looks like." Margaret smiled, the sea's whisper balm to her scars. "Then let's start there, Daniel. One brushstroke at a time." Months later, the community center buzzed with a new exhibition, Sophie's first. Her childish paintings hung alongside Margaret's. The locals cheered, their pride in Margaret unwavering. Daniel, now working as a handyman in St. Ives, attended, his eyes free of the ambition that had once blinded him. Clara's absence was a silent victory, her influence fading like a poorly mixed color. Margaret stood by the window, watching the sea. The inheritance had given her more than wealth, it had given her clarity, the power to choose who deserved her love. She'd chosen Sophie, her community, herself. And in that choice, she'd painted a new life, vibrant and unapologetic, on the canvas of her heart. The moral of The Forgotten Artist is that true family is defined by respect and genuine connection, not convenience or financial gain. Margaret's journey teaches that self-worth and dignity are more valuable than reconciling with those who only return when they need something. By choosing to protect her peace and invest in her community, she shows that empowerment comes from recognizing one's own value and surrounding oneself with those who honor it, regardless of blood ties.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, it really helps. Watch the full video for more details.